On a clear night, away from city lights, the sky fills with around 2,000 stars. They look close enough to touch, scattered across the dome of the atmosphere like sparks frozen in glass. But that impression is one of the most misleading things the human eye has ever told the human brain. Every single point of light you can see from the ground with the naked eye is impossibly far away. And the closest of all of them, the one star beyond our own sun that sits nearest to us in space, is so remote that the word close almost loses its meaning the moment you apply it. That star is called Proxima Centauri. It sits roughly 4.24 light-years from Earth, which means it takes light, the fastest thing in the known universe, more than 4 years to make the crossing. Light covers about 186,000 miles every single second. In the time it takes you to blink, a beam of light has already lapped the Earth 7 times, and even at that velocity, the journey from here to Proxima takes over 4 years without pause. If you tried to cross that distance in the fastest spacecraft humanity has ever built, you would not arrive in your lifetime. You would not arrive in your children's lifetime. Your grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren would not be alive to see it either. This is the situation we are in. The nearest star in the entire galaxy is so far away that it sits beyond any technology we currently possess. Beyond any timeline most governments or institutions are willing to plan for, and possibly beyond any practical limit for human biology as we understand it. The distance is not a problem of ambition or funding or political will. It is a problem written into the physics of the universe itself, and the deeper you look into it, the more clearly you see just how formidable that problem really is. Numbers alone don't capture it. 4 light-years sounds like a tidy figure, manageable almost. But there is a way to feel it, and it begins by stepping back through everything humanity has actually done in space. The farthest any human being has ever traveled from Earth was during the Apollo missions to the Moon. The Moon sits about 239,000 miles away. That journey, which was the most audacious thing our species had ever attempted, took roughly 3 days. The Apollo astronauts moved at speeds approaching 25,000 miles per hour, and the Moon still took 3 days to reach. Proxima Centauri is roughly 100 million times farther away than the Moon. Not 100 times, not 1,000 times, 100 million times. Consider the spacecraft we actually have in interstellar space right now. Voyager 1, launched in 1977, has been traveling continuously for nearly half a century. It moves at about 38,000 miles per hour, faster than any crewed vehicle ever flown. As of the mid-2020s, it has covered roughly 15 billion miles, making it the most distant human-made object in existence. And if Voyager 1 were pointed directly at Proxima Centauri and left to travel at its current speed, it would arrive in approximately 74,000 years. The Parker Solar Probe, the fastest spacecraft ever built, reached speeds of about 394,000 miles per hour during close solar passes. At that velocity, more than 10 times faster than Voyager, the trip to Proxima Centauri would still take roughly 6,500 years. The New Horizons probe, which crossed the entire breadth of our solar system and reached Pluto after a 9-year journey, moves at about 52,000 miles per hour. At that pace, it would take some 54,000 years to reach our nearest stellar neighbor. These numbers reveal something important. The problem isn't just that our spacecraft are slow, it's that the gap between how fast we can currently travel and how fast we need to travel is so enormous that incremental improvements in rocket technology will not close it. Getting twice as fast, or even 10 times as fast, still leaves you facing thousands of years of travel. To reach Proxima Centauri, in any time frame meaningful to human civilization, you would need to travel at a significant fraction of the speed of light. And nothing with mass has ever come close to that. It helps to think about what lies between here and there, not as empty nothingness, but as structured space our spacecraft would need to actually cross. Voyager 1 is sometimes described as having entered interstellar space, and in a technical sense this is true. It crossed the heliopause in 2012, passing beyond the boundary where the Sun's solar wind is overcome by the pressure of the interstellar medium. At that point, it was roughly 121 astronomical units from the Sun, about 11 billion miles out. That sounds enormous, and it is. But it represents less than 0.2% of the distance to Proxima Centauri. Voyager 1 has been flying for nearly 50 years and has not yet traveled 0.2% of the way to the nearest star. Beyond the heliopause lies the Oort cloud, a vast spherical halo of icy bodies extending from roughly 2,000 astronomical units out to perhaps 100,000 astronomical units from the Sun. This is the region that produces long-period comets, objects nudged inward by the gravitational influence of passing stars or the slow drift of galactic tides. The outer edge of the Oort cloud marks the effective gravitational boundary of our solar system, the point at which the Sun's influence finally fades into the background. Voyager 1 will not reach the inner edge of the Oort cloud for another 300 years. It will take approximately 30,000 years to pass all the way through it. Proxima Centauri sits on the far side of that vast region of space. Even after crossing the 50,000 astronomical units of the Oort cloud, a spacecraft would still have most of its journey ahead of it. The solar system, which we tend to think of as our local neighborhood, is in reality almost the entire distance to our closest neighbor. The gap between where our Sun's influence ends and where Proxima Centauri's begins is only a small fraction of the total journey. Most of the crossing is simply the deep, cold void between systems. The core of the problem is energy. Moving a spacecraft fast enough to cross interstellar distances in a reasonable time requires a quantity of energy that dwarfs anything humanity currently produces. And the physics of rocket travel compounds this challenge in a particularly unforgiving way. Traditional chemical rockets work by burning fuel and expelling the exhaust in one direction to push the spacecraft in the other. The ratio of fuel to payload required to reach a given speed follows an exponential curve. The faster you want to go, the disproportionately more fuel you need. This relationship, described by a formula called the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation, means that even if you could build a chemically powered spacecraft pointed at Proxima Centauri, the amount of fuel required to accelerate it to a fraction of the speed of light would be absurd. You would need a vehicle almost entirely composed of propellant, with only a tiny sliver at the tip devoted to actual spacecraft. And you would still face the problem of carrying enough fuel to slow down at the other end, because arriving at 10% of the speed of light and having no way to decelerate is not an arrival, it's a death sentence. This is why the most serious proposals for interstellar travel abandon the idea of carrying fuel altogether and look elsewhere. Nuclear propulsion has been studied since the 1950s. Project Orion, conceived in the late 1950s and developed by physicist Freeman Dyson and others, proposed detonating a rapid sequence of nuclear bombs behind a spacecraft to push it forward. Estimates placed its potential top speed at somewhere between 3 and 10% of the speed of light, still meaning a journey to Proxima of anywhere from 40 to 140 years. And that's before solving the colossal engineering and political challenges of a bomb-driven spacecraft. Project Daedalus, a detailed study carried out by the British Interplanetary Society in the 1970s, proposed a fusion rocket using pellets of deuterium and helium. 3 ignited by electron beams, reaching perhaps 12% of light speed and arriving at its target in roughly 36 years. No helium-3 mining operation exists. No fusion engine of this kind has ever been tested, let alone built. The concept was a genuine achievement of theoretical engineering, but it remained firmly theoretical. The most striking proposal of the modern era is Breakthrough Starshot, announced in 2016 by billionaire Yuri Milner, with Stephen Hawking as a public face of the initiative. The idea was to send not a crewed ship, and not even a conventional probe, but a fleet of gram-scale nanocrafts, essentially computer chips attached to gossamer-thin sails, and accelerate them using a powerful ground-based laser array. With enough laser power, perhaps 100 gigawatts focused through a beam several kilometers wide, these tiny probes could theoretically be pushed to 20% of the speed of light, reaching Proxima Centauri in about 20 years. It was the most credible proposal for reaching another star within a human lifetime ever put forward. Milner pledged $100 million to prove the concept. By 2025, however, the project had largely stalled. According to detailed reporting in Scientific American, the initiative had spent only about $4.5 million of that promised funding across roughly 30 research contracts. The problems turned out to be harder than anticipated at almost every level. The lasers themselves would need to output roughly the combined power of several large nuclear plants, focused with extraordinary precision onto a target moving at an appreciable fraction of the speed of light. Atmospheric turbulence alone would scatter the beam enough to make the task extraordinarily complex. The sail material needed to be simultaneously transparent enough to not vaporize under the laser, reflective enough to capture momentum, and light enough to weigh about a gram while spanning 4 meters across. Silicon nitride emerged as the leading candidate material, and small-scale prototypes showed genuine promise. But scaling that to a functioning interstellar sail remained a distant goal. The communications problem received even less attention. A nanocraft arriving at Proxima Centauri needs to transmit its findings back across 4.24 light-years, and the signal from a gram-scale transmitter would be so faint that even receiving it would require extraordinary infrastructure on Earth. The dream was real. The execution proved far beyond. What Breakthrough Starshot did accomplish was something subtler but important. It proved that interstellar travel was worth thinking about rigorously, that real physicists and engineers could map the problem in detail, and that the obstacles, while severe, were problems of engineering and cost rather than fundamental violations of physics. The stars are not forbidden. They are simply very, very difficult. The deceleration problem deserves its own moment of attention because it is easy to overlook and genuinely brutal in its implications. Almost every discussion of interstellar propulsion focuses on acceleration, getting up to speed, but a spacecraft that accelerates all the way to Proxima Centauri with no way to stop is not exploring the system. It is performing a flyby at enormous velocity with perhaps a few hours of close observation before the system shrinks behind it. For any mission that wants to enter orbit, land, or allow crew members to actually live at the destination, you need to slow down. And slowing down requires the same energy as speeding up, which means the same propellant budget applied in reverse. A crewed mission that needs to decelerate at the far end needs to either carry all its braking fuel from Earth, roughly doubling the already impossible fuel mass, or find some way to shed velocity using the destination system's resources, whether that means aerobraking through a planetary atmosphere, electromagnetic drag through the stellar wind, or some other technique that does not yet exist in practical form. For Breakthrough Starshot's nanocrafts, this problem was acknowledged and set aside. The mission was conceived as a pure flyby, with no deceleration at all. The probes would blast through the system at 20% of light speed and transmit whatever they could capture in those fleeting hours. For a human mission, setting aside deceleration is not an option. There is also a strategic puzzle that interstellar mission planners call the overtaking problem. Suppose humanity launches the best possible crewed ship today using the fastest propulsion we can currently build. It will be slow, and it will take thousands of years. Now suppose that 100 years from now, some technological breakthrough permits a ship that can travel 10 times faster. That future ship, launched a century after the first, would overtake the original crew within the journey and arrive centuries before them, possibly with the infrastructure to receive them, but possibly with a civilization so transformed that the original mission has no clear purpose. This dilemma was first described in science fiction, but is taken seriously by researchers. It implies that launching a slow, crude mission before the propulsion problem is truly solved is strategically irrational. The calculation says, wait for the faster technology because anything you launch now will be overtaken. But waiting indefinitely is its own trap. If every generation waits for better technology, no one ever goes. The tension has no clean resolution, but it is one more reason why the decision to commit to an interstellar mission is not simply an engineering problem. It is also a question of timing, of civilization, and of what we are willing to give up in the interest of being first. Even if the propulsion challenge was somehow solved, there is a second set of problems waiting at the other end of the journey. Proxima Centauri is not the kind of star that invites visitors. It is a red dwarf, a class of star that makes up the majority of stars in the galaxy, but which is profoundly different from our sun. Red dwarfs are small, dim, and cool by stellar standards. Proxima Centauri contains only about 12% of the sun's mass and burns at a surface temperature of roughly 2,980 Kelvin, compared to the sun's roughly 5,778 Kelvin. In terms of raw energy output, it emits only about 1,000th of the light our sun produces. A planet would need to orbit very close to this star to receive enough warmth for liquid water to exist on its surface, far closer than Mercury sits to our own sun. In 2016, astronomers announced the discovery of a planet in exactly that zone. Named Proxima Centauri b, it orbits its star at a distance of about 4.6 million miles, roughly 20 times closer to its star than Earth is to the sun, and completes one orbit every 11.2 Earth days. Detected through the Doppler wobble it induces in its star, the planet has a minimum mass close to Earth's and sits within what scientists call the habitable zone, the orbital band where liquid water could theoretically persist on a rocky surface. The discovery made headlines around the world. Around our closest stellar neighbor was a world that might be habitable. It was the best lead in the history of the search for places beyond Earth where humans could one day live. The more scientists studied it, the more complicated that picture became. The first major issue is tidal locking. A planet orbiting so close to its star experiences an enormous gravitational pull, and over geological timescales, that pull synchronizes the planet's rotation with its orbit. The result is that one hemisphere permanently faces the star in an eternal blaze of light, while the other faces the void in permanent darkness. There is no sunrise or sunset on Proxima b. The same side of the planet always faces the same direction. Whether an atmosphere could redistribute heat between those hemispheres well enough to create livable conditions across a meaningful portion of the surface is an open question. Climate models suggest it might be possible, but only under specific conditions that we cannot currently verify. The second problem is the star itself, and it is more serious. Proxima Centauri is a flare star, which means it erupts frequently and violently, releasing enormous bursts of energy and charged particles into the space around it. These are not the modest solar flares our own sun produces. In 2017, a team led by astronomer Meredith McGregor detected a super flare from Proxima Centauri using the ALMA radio telescope array. At its peak, the flare boosted the star's brightness by a factor of 1,000 over just 10 seconds. A flare of that magnitude, in the context of a planet orbiting 20 times closer to its star than Earth is to the sun, would blast any nearby world with roughly 4,000 times the radiation that Earth receives from our sun's largest flares. These events are not rare. Proxima Centauri produces powerful flares regularly, and research published in 2025 using ALMA's millimeter wavelength observations revealed that the star's high-energy flaring was even more intense than optical measurements had suggested. The millimeter wave flare rate follows a different, steeper distribution, meaning that smaller flares, which occur far more frequently, are releasing more extreme UV radiation into the planetary environment than scientists had previously estimated. As McGregor, who led that work, explained, if you only look at optical wavelengths, you are missing a significant part of the picture. The planet is bathed in radiation we are only now beginning to fully account for. This matters enormously for the question of atmosphere. Proxima b receives roughly 60 times more extreme ultraviolet radiation and about 250 times more X-rays than Earth receives from the Sun. That radiation ionizes atmospheric gases, stripping electrons from atoms, creating charged particles that can escape the planet's gravity more easily. Over billions of years, this process can strip an atmosphere away entirely. A NASA study published in 2017 modeled what would happen if Earth's atmosphere were placed in Proxima b's orbital environment. The result was stark. The model predicted atmospheric escape occurring up to 10,000 times faster than the rate at which Earth loses gas today. The ozone layer, the thin shield that protects life from damaging ultraviolet light, would be repeatedly destroyed by intense flares. Whether Proxima b ever had an atmosphere thick enough to resist this sustained assault, and whether any remnant survives today, is simply unknown. The planet does not transit its star from Earth's perspective, which is the usual method of detecting atmospheric signatures. We cannot currently observe its atmosphere directly. There is debate in the scientific community about how bleak the situation truly is. Some researchers argue that if Proxima b formed with a large reservoir of water, it might have retained enough to support a deep ocean, and that ocean could shield life beneath its surface from the worst of the radiation, while photosynthesis of a kind might occur in deeper water layers. Others point to the pre-main sequence phase of Proxima Centauri's history, during which the star was even more luminous and active for a period that likely lasted 180 million years, long enough that any water present on Proxima b may have been boiled away before the planet ever had a chance to cool into habitability. The scientific jury is genuinely still out, but the honest assessment in 2025 is that the world astronomers were most excited about for over a decade looks increasingly like a hostile place rather than a welcoming one. Proxima Centauri does not travel through space alone. It is gravitationally bound, loosely but genuinely, to a pair of stars known as Alpha Centauri A and Alpha Centauri b, which orbit each other at a distance comparable to the distance between our Sun and Saturn. Together, these three form a triple star system, and the other two members of it are in many ways far more similar to our own Sun than Proxima is. Alpha Centauri A is slightly larger and brighter than the Sun, about 10% more massive and roughly 1.5 times as luminous. Alpha Centauri b is slightly smaller and dimmer, about 90% of the Sun's mass and half its luminosity. Both are classified as yellow-orange dwarf stars of the kind that makes up the stable, long-lived population of the galaxy, not the energetic, unpredictable red dwarfs that produce extreme flare activity. Alpha Centauri A and B orbit their common center of mass every 79 years, ranging in separation between roughly 11 and 36 astronomical units over that period. At their closest approach, they are about as far from each other as Saturn is from the Sun. At their widest, they are nearly as far apart as Neptune is from our Sun. The existence of planets in such a tight binary system is itself a complex question. Computer simulations suggest that stable planetary orbits can exist around each individual star in the pair, at distances up to roughly 3 astronomical units from each one, which would include the zone where liquid water could persist. Whether such planets actually exist is still being investigated. Radial velocity surveys have looked, but the mutual gravitational influence of the two stars on each other creates a noise signal in the data that makes detecting smaller Earth-like worlds difficult. As of 2025, no confirmed planet has been found around either Alpha Centauri A or Alpha Centauri b, though claims and counterclaims have been made over the years and the question remains open. Proxima Centauri itself sits about 13,000 astronomical units from the AB pair, roughly 0.2 light-years. This is close enough to be gravitationally bound to the system, but so distant that Proxima takes somewhere between 550,000 and several million years to complete a single orbit around the pair. Whether Proxima Centauri genuinely formed alongside Alpha Centauri A and B, or was captured into the system later, is not fully settled. The three stars share a similar velocity through space, which is the primary evidence for a shared origin, but no simulation has definitively established whether they formed together from the same molecular cloud. Why does this matter for interstellar travel? Because the Alpha Centauri system represents the full neighborhood around our nearest stellar destination, and the three-body gravitational environment introduces complications for any mission that plans to explore the region rather than simply pass through it. A spacecraft approaching Proxima Centauri at high speed would need to account for the gravitational influence not just of Proxima itself, but of the AB pair in the background. For a probe making a flyby, this is a navigational calculation. For a spacecraft attempting to decelerate into orbit around Proxima, or one of its planets, the forces involved must be mapped and managed with precision. More interestingly, the proximity of three stars, two of which are Sun-like, raises the question of whether this system might have multiple habitable worlds, and whether a mission to the nearest star is in fact a mission to a neighborhood, rather than a single destination. The AB pair sits about 0.22 light-years beyond Proxima from our current position. If humanity ever established a presence at Proxima, the next nearest solar systems would be Alpha Centauri A and B themselves, each potentially hosting undiscovered worlds of their own. Suppose you solved the propulsion problem. Suppose you built a spacecraft capable of reaching 20% of the speed of light. A new problem emerges immediately, and it is one that grows more severe the faster you travel. The space between stars is not a vacuum in the way that word is commonly understood. It contains gas, primarily hydrogen and helium, at extraordinarily low densities, along with trace amounts of heavier elements, dust grains, and the occasional larger particle. At the scale of everyday experience, interstellar space is as close to nothing as anything gets. But at a significant fraction of the speed of light, that near nothing becomes dangerous. A spacecraft traveling at 20% of the speed of light, about 134 million miles per hour, strikes interstellar hydrogen atoms, not as gentle taps, but as high-energy collisions. Each atom becomes a particle moving at relativistic speed relative to the spacecraft, delivering a small but real dose of radiation to the ship and its crew. The cumulative effect over years of travel through even the sparse interstellar medium would be significant. More dramatically, any dust grain, even one a fraction of a millimeter across, becomes a catastrophic projectile at those speeds. A grain of interstellar dust carries kinetic energy proportional to the square of velocity, which means a speck of material that would pose no threat at normal speeds becomes a miniature explosion at relativistic velocities. Breakthrough. Starshot's engineers estimated that each square centimeter of frontal area on a nanocraft would collide with roughly 1,000 particles larger than 0.1 micrometers during the journey. For a gram-scale chip, that might be manageable with clever shielding design. For a spacecraft capable of carrying people, the challenge is vastly more severe. One proposed solution involves sending fast-moving, smaller particles ahead of the spacecraft to detonate larger obstacles before the ship arrives. Another involves magnetic shielding to deflect charged particles. Neither approach is anywhere near a working prototype, and both solutions add mass, complexity, and cost to a mission that is already barely conceivable. The interstellar medium is not an insurmountable barrier, but it is one more entry on a list of barriers that is already very long. On top of it all, there remains the human body itself, which was not designed for space and which deteriorates in predictable ways when placed in it for long periods. In low Earth orbit, aboard the International Space Station, astronauts experience a well-documented suite of physiological changes. Muscles waste without the constant mechanical loading that gravity provides. Bones lose density at a rate that is significant even on missions lasting a few months. Fluid shifts toward the head, raising pressure around the eyes and brain, causing vision changes that in some astronauts have proved persistent long after returning to Earth. The cardiovascular system, which on Earth pumps blood upward against gravity, adapts to weightlessness in ways that make it less efficient when gravity returns. The immune system shows altered function. These effects are manageable for 6-month missions because astronauts return to Earth and their bodies, mostly, recover. On a journey to Proxima Centauri, measured in decades, or more likely generations, recovery is not part of the plan. But the more alarming problem is radiation. Inside Earth's magnetosphere, astronauts are shielded from most cosmic radiation. The moment you leave that protective bubble, which extends roughly 60,000 kilometers from Earth's surface, the situation changes dramatically. Deep space is permeated by galactic cosmic rays, the nuclei of atoms accelerated to near light speed by violent events elsewhere in the galaxy, primarily supernova explosions. These are not like the X-rays a doctor uses or the gamma rays produced by radioactive decay on Earth. They are massive particles, protons, helium nuclei, and heavier ions up to iron, moving at 99% or more of the speed of light and carrying extraordinary amounts of energy. They pass through metal walls as though they were not there. They pass through flesh the same way. When a high-energy heavy ion transits a cell nucleus, it can shred the DNA double helix with a directness that conventional radiation cannot match. The repair mechanisms that cells normally use to fix radiation damage work less efficiently against these high linear energy transfer particles. During transit outside low Earth orbit, every cell nucleus in an astronaut's body would be passed through by a hydrogen ion every few days, and by a heavier cosmic ray nucleus every few months. The damage accumulates. NASA studies estimate that astronauts on long, deep space missions face substantial elevated lifetime risk of cancer, cataracts, and cardiovascular disease. But those estimates carry large uncertainties, partly because only 24 people, the Apollo astronauts, have ever spent significant time beyond Earth's protective field, and they were gone for at most 2 weeks. The neurological effects are perhaps the most disturbing aspect of what the research has uncovered. Studies using mice exposed to simulated cosmic ray environments found that radiation damaged the neural circuits connecting neurons into networks, impairing learning, memory, and mood. The specific concern is that heavy ions, uniquely among radiation types, produce a persistent disruption of the fine structures on neurons, the dendrites and synaptic connections that form the physical substrate of thought. A crew member on a years-long interstellar voyage, subjected to constant cosmic ray bombardment, might suffer cognitive decline, mood disorders, and impaired decision-making at precisely the moments when clear thinking is most needed. There is currently no way to shield against galactic cosmic rays using practical mass budgets. Thick lead shielding might help against some particles, But the most energetic cosmic rays simply generate secondary radiation cascades inside whatever material you use to stop them, meaning that thin shielding can make the problem worse rather than better. The calculation becomes grimmer still when you account for the timeline. Even if a spacecraft could reach Proxima Centauri in 40 or 50 years, requiring propulsion technology far beyond anything we currently possess, the crew would spend those decades in a radiation environment with no precedent in human experience and no reliable way of knowing how long human tissue and cognition can endure it. There is one dimension of human biology in space that receives less public attention than radiation, but may be equally important for any mission involving the long-term presence of people beyond Earth: reproduction. The question of whether human beings can conceive, carry, and successfully deliver children in a space environment has not been answered. It has barely been studied. No human has ever been pregnant in orbit. No embryo has developed in microgravity. The research that exists comes almost entirely from animal studies, and the results are not reassuring. Experiments carried out on rodents aboard the Space Shuttle and the International Space Station found that the early stages of embryonic development are sensitive to microgravity in ways that are not yet fully understood. In some studies, fertilization rates fell, and the progression through early developmental stages, cell division, blastocyst formation, implantation, was disrupted compared to ground controls. Japanese researchers working with the JAXA space program found that mouse embryos, frozen as two-cell embryos and thawed aboard the ISS, developed into blastocysts at rates comparable to ground controls, which was an encouraging result, suggesting that early cell division might be more robust than feared. But the critical question, whether a fertilized embryo can implant successfully into a uterine wall in microgravity, and whether the subsequent months of development in that environment produce a healthy organism, has not been tested in any mammal, let alone in a human being. The radiation problem compounds this directly. Egg cells, which exist in a woman's body from before birth and are not replaced during her lifetime, are among the most radiation-sensitive cells in the human body. A multi-decade interstellar voyage would expose a woman's entire lifetime supply of eggs to sustained cosmic ray bombardment. Sperm cells are produced continuously and turn over quickly, which makes them somewhat less vulnerable to cumulative exposure. But they are not immune. Studies in male astronauts have shown chromosomal changes in sperm cells after even relatively short ISS missions. The implications for the reproductive health of any crew attempting to sustain a population across decades or generations in deep space are deeply uncertain. But the uncertainty itself is a serious problem. You cannot design a mission that requires births to succeed over many generations without having any idea whether births in that environment are biologically feasible. Bone density loss creates a further reproductive complication. The female pelvis, which in the context of childbirth serves a critical structural function, is among the regions of the body that experience significant bone density reduction during extended spaceflight. Whether pelvic structure remains adequate to support natural delivery after years of microgravity-induced bone loss is unknown. Caesarean delivery in a spacecraft environment, under the sterile conditions and with the surgical support available, is a different challenge from the same procedure in a hospital. These are not arguments that interstellar human reproduction is impossible. They are arguments that we currently have almost no idea whether it is possible, and that the gap in our knowledge is one that no amount of ground-based theorizing can fill. It would need to be tested, in orbit, over years, before it could be relied upon as a pillar of any long-duration mission design. Given the mismatch between the distances involved and human lifespan, one solution has been proposed repeatedly over the past century. Build a ship large enough to sustain not a crew but a civilization, and send it on a journey that unfolds over multiple generations. The people who arrive at Proxima Centauri would be the descendants of the people who left Earth. No individual would survive the full crossing. The ship itself would be the world. The idea has a long intellectual history. Robert Goddard, the American rocket pioneer, wrote about long-duration interstellar journeys as early as 1918. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, one of the theoretical fathers of rocketry, described a self-sufficient Noah's Ark in space in 1928. In science fiction, the concept appeared in Robert Heinlein's Orphans of the Sky, Brian Aldiss's Non-Stop, and dozens of other works, nearly all of which treated the multi-generational ship as a setting for tragedy, degradation, and social collapse rather than triumph. Those fictional pessimisms reflect real problems that researchers have spent serious effort trying to quantify. The minimum crew size required to maintain genetic diversity across a journey lasting thousands of years has been calculated by Frédéric Marin and Camille Bellouffi using a simulation tool they called Heritage. Their conclusion was that at the speeds achievable with near-future technology, which they took to be roughly the speed of the Parker Solar Probe, meaning a journey of about 6,300 years, a minimum crew of 98 people would be needed at departure to ensure the population arrived genetically healthy. That number assumes reasonable rates of fertility, mortality, and intermarriage, and does not account for the ways that radiation might reduce the chances of healthy pregnancies or elevate mutation rates over successive generations. The Project Hyperion design competition, run by the Initiative for Interstellar Studies starting in 2024, took a different approach. Rather than focusing purely on propulsion, it asked interdisciplinary teams of architects, engineers, and social scientists to design the habitat and social systems of a generation, ship capable of sustaining around 1,000 people for 250 years, the kind of journey that more speculative propulsion systems might enable. The winning concept, called Chrysalis, proposed a cigar-shaped vessel about 36 miles long that would rotate to generate artificial gravity. Its population would be carefully managed, with births planned to maintain sustainable numbers. Before departure, the initial generations of passengers would spend 70 to 80 years living in isolated Antarctic biospheres, both to select suitable people and to begin forming the shared identity and culture that the ship's descendants would need to maintain across centuries. What struck the researchers most about these designs was how much harder the social problems were than the engineering ones. The engineering of a closed-loop life support system is formidable. Everything recycled, nothing wasted, crops grown in artificial light, water processed endlessly. But the engineering challenges can at least be stated clearly and measured against targets. The social challenges are different in kind. A community of 1,000 people, sealed in a metal cylinder for 250 years with no possibility of leaving, no immigration from outside, no contact with human civilization except for delayed radio signals, would be subjected to pressures unlike any human society has ever experienced. The population's values, culture, technical knowledge, and social structures would need to be maintained not just for years or decades, but for generations, across a span of time during which human civilization on Earth would transform beyond recognition. The people who arrived at Proxima Centauri might share no cultural common ground with the people who launched the mission, and the descendants born on the ship would have consented to none of it. This is the ethical dimension that makes the generation ship not just an engineering question, but a philosophical one. The founders of such a mission would be making a binding, irrevocable decision on behalf of everyone who came after them. Every person born on the ship would arrive without a choice about their world, their vocation, the size of their community, or their destination. The philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote about natality, the idea that the capacity of human beings to begin new things is what gives them freedom. A generation ship forecloses that capacity for everyone aboard it. The question of whether that can be made ethical and under what conditions has no obvious answer. Even the most pragmatic objection is powerful. What happens when something breaks? Mechanical systems fail. Electronic systems degrade. Spare parts can only carry so far, and manufacturing replacements requires industrial infrastructure that no ship could plausibly contain in full. Even the Voyager probes, built with the best solid-state technology of their era, required rerouting of software to bypass failed memory chips nearly half a century into their journeys. A 250-year voyage with human lives depending on life support machinery, structural integrity, and every subsystem functioning through multiple failures and repairs would test engineering in a way nothing in history has approached. The life support challenge deserves more scrutiny than it typically receives in popular accounts of interstellar travel. Keeping people alive for years in space is already something the ISS does, but it does so in a fundamentally open loop. Rockets deliver food and water regularly, and waste products are managed with resupply in mind. An interstellar ship cannot rely on resupply of any kind. Every calorie consumed, every liter of water drunk, every breath of oxygen exhaled must be recovered and recycled within the ship itself. The efficiency of such a system, what engineers call its closure fraction, must approach 100% for any long mission, because even a tiny loss rate compounds into catastrophe over years. Lose just 1% of your water per year, and over a 250-year journey, you have lost all of it. Every material cycle, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, water, must be maintained indefinitely by biological and mechanical systems operating in concert, with no external input. The closest humanity has come to testing a closed ecological system at human scale was Biosphere 2, the sealed habitat constructed in the Arizona desert in the early 1990s. 8 people were sealed inside a 3.14-acre glass enclosure for 2 years beginning in 1991, with the intention of sustaining themselves entirely from the system's internal ecology. The experiment encountered serious problems almost immediately. Carbon dioxide levels fluctuated wildly, rising to concentrations that caused cognitive impairment and fatigue. Oxygen levels dropped steadily, eventually to concentrations equivalent to living at 13,000 feet altitude, partly because microbes in the soil consumed oxygen faster than the plants produced it, and partly because the concrete of the structure was chemically absorbing carbon dioxide in ways the designers had not anticipated. Food production fell short of nutritional targets, and all 8 crew members lost significant body weight. The experiment produced invaluable data about the complexity of closed ecological systems, but it also demonstrated how many interactions between soil chemistry, atmospheric composition, plant biology, and microbial ecology were not understood well enough to control. An interstellar ship would need to solve all of those problems, and solve them with no mission control to consult and no possibility of opening a hatch to the outside world. None of this makes the generation ship impossible in principle. It makes it an engineering challenge of an order that nothing in our current technological experience has prepared us for. The ship that could sustain a population of 1,000 people for 250 years in genuine ecological closure would represent an achievement comparable to building the first nuclear reactor or sequencing the first human genome, a milestone so far beyond its predecessors that it would take decades of dedicated research and failed prototypes to achieve. The difference is that nuclear reactors and gene sequences could be tested and refined on Earth before being deployed. A generation ship cannot be meaningfully tested anywhere other than space itself, across timescales that exceed the careers of every researcher involved in designing it. Somewhere between the generation ship, which accepts that the journey will span many lifetimes, and the relativistic voyage, which compresses time itself, lies a third concept that appeals to the intuition even as it strains the biology: suspended animation. Put the crew to sleep, slow every process in their bodies to a near halt, and wake them at the destination. The journey that would otherwise consume decades of conscious suffering, deteriorating life, becomes, for the sleepers, almost nothing at all. It is an idea so intuitive that science fiction absorbed it long before science caught up. From 2001, A Space Odyssey, to Alien to Passengers, the image of humans sealed in translucent pods, their chests barely moving, frost on the glass, waiting out the void. It has become one of the defining visual languages of the genre. What is less clear, and what matters far more, is how close the actual biology is to making it real. The honest answer is that it is closer than most people realize, and farther than the fiction suggests. In emergency medicine, a technique called therapeutic hypothermia has been used for decades to protect the brains of patients who have suffered cardiac arrest or severe trauma. By cooling a patient's core body temperature from the normal 37 degrees Celsius down to somewhere between 32 and 34 degrees, the molecular mechanism underlying their radiation resistance involves a protein called DASOP, or damage suppressor, that physically associates with their DNA and shields it from ionizing radiation. In 2016, researchers from the University of Tokyo introduced the gene encoding DESRP into human cultured cells and found that it reduced radiation-induced DNA damage by roughly 40%. This was not transformative protection, but it was a measurable effect produced by a single gene from an animal distantly related to humans. It raised, for the first time, a serious question about whether genetic tools derived from extremophile biology might one day be applied to make human cells meaningfully more resistant to the deep space radiation environment. None of this constitutes a path to interstellar suspended animation. What it constitutes is a direction, a set of biological principles demonstrated in organisms that are actually alive on Earth, which point toward the possibility that the constraints on human endurance in space are not fixed forever. The tardigrade did not evolve its capabilities to help us reach other stars. It evolved them to survive drought and temperature extremes in a pond. But the molecular toolkit it developed in doing so turns out to be relevant to a problem we did not yet have when the tardigrade first appeared, roughly 530 million years ago. That is the nature of biology. It solves problems in ways that generalize unexpectedly. Whether human biotechnology can take those solutions and apply them at the scale an interstellar mission requires is a question that cannot be answered yet. The research is early, but it is no longer purely speculative. There is one aspect of the journey to Proxima Centauri that actually gets better as you go faster, and it sits in the counterintuitive territory of Einstein's theory of special relativity. When an object moves at a significant fraction of the speed of light, time passes more slowly for that object than for a stationary observer. This is not a theoretical abstraction. It has been confirmed repeatedly in experiments, including measurements of subatomic particles in particle accelerators, and the GPS satellite network requires relativistic corrections to stay accurate. The effect is real and measurable. At speeds approaching the speed of light, the discrepancy becomes dramatic. A spacecraft traveling at 99% of light speed would cover 4.24 light years of distance in 4.28 years as measured by clocks on Earth, but the crew would experience only about 8 months. At 99.9% of light speed, the crew's subjective journey time would shrink to under 2 months. At 99.99%, it would take only weeks. This means that interstellar travel is not, in principle, forbidden by human lifespan. If you could travel fast enough, you could reach Proxima Centauri in what feels like a short time. The universe does not prevent humans from visiting other stars. It simply requires a speed that is almost unimaginably difficult to achieve, while simultaneously ensuring that the Earth you left has aged by years during your brief subjective journey. This asymmetry has its own strange implications. A crew traveling at 99.99% of light speed to Proxima Centauri and back would return to Earth having aged only a few weeks, but would find that Earth had aged more than 8 years in their absence. Everyone they knew would be 8 years older. There is no way to get around this. The relativistic time difference is baked into the structure of space-time. The practical question is what it would take to reach those speeds. The energy required to accelerate a spacecraft with human passengers to 99% of the speed of light is enormous, far beyond what any proposed propulsion system could deliver. Antimatter annihilation, the most energy-dense reaction physically possible, converts mass entirely into energy with an efficiency of 100%. If you could engineer a propulsion system that used pure antimatter fuel, you could, in principle, accelerate to relativistic speeds. But producing antimatter in useful quantities is currently a task that humanity performs only inside particle accelerators. Manufacturing it in quantities measured in nanograms per year at costs that would be absurd for any mission planning. A crewed spacecraft to Proxima Centauri using antimatter propulsion would require kilograms or tons of antimatter fuel, a quantity that would take the world's current accelerator infrastructure millions of years to produce. The physics permits it. The technology does not exist. The gap between those two statements represents most of what makes interstellar human travel currently impossible. The distinction between sending a probe and sending a person is not just a matter of what fits in the spacecraft. It is the difference between a manageable engineering challenge and one that may be beyond our civilization's current reach. A probe does not need food, water, breathable air, or psychological support. It does not suffer radiation damage in the way that living cells do. It does not age, mourn, or require meaning. A probe can be built to tolerances that would be lethal to any biological passenger, accelerated at forces that would crush a human, subjected to radiation doses that would be immediately fatal, reduced to a gram of electronics and a reflective sail, and launched at a fraction of the speed of light. If Breakthrough Starshot's technical challenges are eventually solved over the coming decades, the first thing to cross interstellar space will almost certainly be a machine rather than a person. If a swarm of nanocrafts reach Proxima Centauri at 20% of light speed, they would arrive in about 20 years. The signal confirming their arrival would take another 4 years to reach Earth. We would know something genuine about that system within the lifetimes of people alive today. NASA's ENIAC program selected a concept called Swarming Proxima Centauri, developed by Space Initiatives Inc. and the Initiative for Interstellar Studies and led by Marshall Eubanks for Phase 1. Development in 2024. The concept involves sending a fleet of thousands of lightweight probes, not just dozens, to compensate for the inevitable losses that high-speed interstellar travel would inflict. Of 1,000 probes launched, perhaps a fraction would survive the crossing intact. That fraction might still return enough data to transform our understanding of the Proxima Centauri system. Because the capital cost of such a mission is dominated by the laser infrastructure rather than the probes themselves, sending many probes costs relatively little more than sending one. The redundancy is the point. The 8-year round-trip communication delay imposes another constraint. The probes cannot be remotely controlled from Earth. By the time a command reaches them, the situation that prompted it has long since passed. This means any probe sent to another star must be capable of autonomous navigation, decision-making, and data management, a level of artificial intelligence that does not currently exist, but that researchers are confident will emerge. The probe that visits Proxima Centauri will not phone home asking for instructions. It will need to understand its mission well enough to execute it without supervision. What could such probes discover? In 2025, new ALMA observations confirmed that Proxima Centauri's flaring environment is even more intense than previously understood, raising fresh doubts about Proxima B's ability to hold an atmosphere. But those observations were made remotely from Earth, at a distance of 4.24 light-years, with indirect methods. A probe passing close to Proxima B could measure its atmospheric composition directly, image its surface, assess its magnetic field, and detect the presence of biosignatures, gases that would only be present in meaningful concentrations if life were producing them. The difference between what a flyby probe could learn and what Earth-based telescopes can infer is the difference between reading a book and guessing at its contents from across a football field. The distinction between sending a probe and sending a person is not just a matter of what fits in the spacecraft. It is the difference between a manageable engineering challenge and one that may be beyond our civilization's current reach. A probe does not need food, water, breathable air, or psychological support. It does not suffer radiation damage in the way that living cells do. It does not age, mourn, or require meaning. A probe can be built to tolerances that would be lethal to any biological passenger, accelerated at forces that would crush a human, subjected to radiation doses that would be immediately fatal, reduced to a gram of electronics and a reflective sail, and launched at a fraction of the speed of light. If Breakthrough Starshot's technical challenges are eventually solved over the coming decades, the first thing to cross interstellar space will almost certainly be a machine, rather than a person. If a swarm of nanocrafts reach Proxima Centauri at 20% of light speed, they would arrive in about 20 years. The signal confirming their arrival would take another 4 years to reach Earth. We would know something genuine about that system within the lifetimes of people alive today. NASA's ENIAC program selected a concept called Swarming Proxima Centauri, developed by Space Initiatives Inc. and the Initiative for Interstellar Studies, and led by Marshall Eubanks for Phase 1. Development in 2024. The concept involves sending a fleet of thousands of lightweight probes, not just dozens, to compensate for the inevitable losses that high-speed interstellar travel would inflict. Of 1,000 probes launched, perhaps a fraction would survive the crossing intact. That fraction might still return enough data to transform our understanding of the Proxima Centauri system. Because the capital cost of such a mission is dominated by the laser infrastructure rather than the probes themselves, sending many probes costs relatively little more than sending one. The redundancy is the point. The 8-year round-trip communication delay imposes another constraint. The probes cannot be remotely controlled from Earth. By the time a command reaches them, the situation that prompted it has long since passed. This means any probe sent to another star must be capable of autonomous navigation, decision-making, and data management, a level of artificial intelligence that does not currently exist, but that researchers are confident will emerge. The probe that visits Proxima Centauri will not phone home asking for instructions. It will need to understand its mission well enough to execute it without supervision. What could such probes discover? In 2025, new ALMA observations confirmed that Proxima Centauri's flaring environment is even more intense than previously understood, raising fresh doubts about Proxima B's ability to hold an atmosphere. But those observations were made remotely from Earth, at a distance of 4.24 light-years, with indirect methods. A probe passing close to Proxima B could measure its atmospheric composition directly, image its surface, assess its magnetic field, and detect the presence of biosignatures, gases that would only be present in meaningful concentrations if life were producing them. The difference between what a flyby probe could learn and what Earth-based telescopes can infer is the difference between reading a book and guessing at its contents from across a football field. Picture of the Proxima Centauri system has not been static. Every few years, new discoveries alter what we think we know about it, and not always in reassuring directions. When Proxima B was announced in 2016, it was the only known planet in the system. In subsequent years, potential evidence emerged for a second and possibly a third planet. Proxima C, a candidate super-Earth in a much wider orbit, and tentative hints of further objects. In August 2024, a team using the JWST coronagraph detected a faint signal near Alpha Centauri A, the bright star in the same system, 0.1 light-years farther from Earth than Proxima, which briefly appeared to be a new planet several times Jupiter's mass. Follow-up observations in February and April 2025 failed to detect the same object, leaving researchers puzzled and the result unconfirmed. On Proxima B itself, the news has generally trended darker. The 2025 ALMA millimeter wavelength study of Proxima Centauri's flares found a disconnect between the optical and millimeter wave flare frequency distributions, meaning the star is producing high-energy radiation at a rate that optical-only monitoring had underestimated. The full spectrum of electromagnetic violence this star delivers to its nearest planet is only now being assembled. The picture emerging suggests that any atmosphere Proxima B possesses is being subjected to an assault that would have stripped Earth-like air long ago, unless the planet's magnetic field is exceptional, or the geological processes continually replenishing its atmosphere from within are unusually vigorous. Meanwhile, astrobiologists have begun to think about what forms of life, if any, could survive in such an environment. Underground life, shielded from radiation by rock overburden, remains theoretically possible. Deep ocean life, buffered from the surface by kilometers of water, is also conceivable. Some extremophile bacteria on Earth survive radiation doses that would be fatal to virtually every other living thing. The possibility of life on Proxima B has not been ruled out, but the conditions that would permit it look increasingly unlike anything familiar, and increasingly unlike anything that human beings could survive without extraordinary artificial support. There is a dimension to the problem of reaching Proxima Centauri that has nothing to do with physics or biology, and everything to do with how human civilization actually operates. The longest duration infrastructure projects in history, the great medieval cathedrals of Europe, the Roman road network, the construction of the Great Wall of China, unfolded over decades or centuries, driven by empires, religions, and dynasties with sufficient stability to sustain effort across generations. Most of those institutions still struggle to maintain consistent purpose over long timescales. An interstellar mission, whether a probe program or a crewed voyage, would require sustained commitment at a civilizational scale, lasting not 9 years but potentially a century or more from conception to arrival of useful data. There has never been a human institution capable of sustaining a single technical project at high intensity for a century. The closest analogy might be the construction of the world's great particle accelerators, which have spanned decades and required international cooperation, or the sustained investment in nuclear deterrence that governments have maintained for 80 years out of fear. Neither provides a template for voluntary, expensive, scientifically motivated commitment across generational timescales. The question of who would fund an interstellar program for a century through changes of government, shifts in public interest, economic crises, and competing priorities has no obvious answer. The governance problem runs deeper than funding. An interstellar mission is, almost by definition, a project that no single nation can own, not because of any political ideal, but because the cost and complexity demand pooled resources at a scale that makes international cooperation not optional but necessary. The Large Hadron Collider at CERN involved contributions from over 100 countries and took roughly 25 years from conception to first collisions. The International Space Station required the sustained cooperation of 15 nations across more than 2 decades, and that cooperation was repeatedly threatened by geopolitical friction between the United States and Russia during the post-Cold War 1990s, during conflicts over Ukraine, during the cascade of diplomatic tensions that followed. The ISS survived those strains, but it is a structure in low Earth orbit with a crew that can be evacuated in hours if the partnership collapses. An interstellar mission cannot be evacuated. Once launched, it is committed. Any international consortium that authorizes such a launch must somehow guarantee, across a timeline of decades or centuries, that the political agreement underlying it remains intact. There is no obvious mechanism for making such a guarantee because no governance structure currently exists that can bind nations across generational timescales without their ongoing voluntary participation. Who speaks for the mission once it is underway? The people on the ground who authorized it will be dead before it arrives. Their successors may hold entirely different values and priorities. The crew, or the descendants of the crew, will be beyond any effective authority Earth could exercise, given the communication delays involved. At 4.24 light-years, a message takes 4.24 years to arrive and another 4.24 years for any response to come back. Mission control cannot intervene in real time. Instructions become suggestions. The relationship between the ship and Earth becomes something more like a correspondence than a command structure, and over generations it may fade further than that. The civilization that receives transmissions from the ship's descendants may not even share a language with them. This is not a hypothetical abstraction. It is a direct consequence of the physics of the distance. Some researchers have proposed that an interstellar mission might be better governed not by any nation-state, but by an institution structured more like a religion or a cultural tradition. An organization whose primary function is transmitting a purpose across time, insulating it from the political fluctuations that affect governments and corporations. This is not as far-fetched as it sounds. The Catholic Church has maintained institutional continuity for roughly 2,000 years. Buddhist monasteries in Asia have sustained traditions for comparable timescales. These institutions have done so precisely by investing purpose in something that transcends individual human lifetimes, a belief system, a practice, a community identity that regenerates itself in each generation, rather than depending on the continuity of any single organization's structure. whether a scientific mission could be embedded in a framework of that kind, and whether the framework would maintain fidelity to the mission's original scientific goals, rather than gradually transforming it into something unrecognizable, is genuinely uncertain. But the historical evidence at least suggests that humans are capable of sustaining commitments across centuries when those commitments are woven into identity and meaning, rather than maintained purely by institutional mandate. This is not a counsel of despair. Humanity's technological trajectory has produced, in the past 2 centuries, capabilities that would have seemed magical to any previous generation. The challenge of interstellar travel is enormous, but so was the challenge of powered flight, of computing, of mapping the human genome, of detecting gravitational waves from colliding black holes 1.3 billion light-years away. Each of those achievements required sustained, organized effort, driven by genuine curiosity and the willingness to invest in things that had no immediate practical return. The same impulse that pushed human beings to cross oceans in wooden boats is still present. It has not gone anywhere. The question is whether the civilization that impulse inhabits can organize itself at the scale the problem requires. Sitting outside all of issues is a possibility that researchers are genuinely reluctant to dismiss. That the physics we think we understand may not be the final word. Einstein's general relativity does not forbid the concept of a warp drive. The Alcubierre metric, proposed by Mexican physicist Miguel Alcubierre in 1994, describes a mathematical solution in which a spacecraft sits inside a bubble of flat spacetime, surrounded by regions of spacetime that are compressed in front and expanded behind. From the outside, the bubble itself moves faster than light, but within the bubble, nothing violates local physics. The spacecraft doesn't travel through space, the space around it moves. The practical objections to this concept remain severe. The energy required to create and sustain such a bubble, using conventional matter, was initially estimated at something equivalent to the mass energy of a planet. Refinements to the model have reduced that estimate significantly, but even optimistic calculations remain far beyond anything we can produce. More fundamentally, the kind of exotic matter with negative energy density, that the Alcubierre metric requires may not exist in usable form. Wormholes, which are tunnels through the fabric of spacetime connecting 2 distant points, appear in the equations of general relativity as valid mathematical solutions. Whether they can exist physically, whether they could be held open without collapsing, and whether anything could pass through them, are all questions without settled answers. The universe may contain mechanisms we have not yet discovered that permit connections across vast distances. Or it may not. The honest position is uncertainty. There is, however, a stepping stone considerably more near-term than warp drives and wormholes, one that uses a phenomenon we understand very well and requires propulsion technology only a few generations beyond what we currently have. It is called the solar gravitational lens, and it represents one of the most scientifically powerful concepts in current discussions of deep space exploration. Einstein's general relativity predicts that massive objects bend the path of light passing near them. This is not controversial. It has been confirmed by observations of stars near the edge of the Sun during solar eclipses, by the behavior of light around galaxy clusters, and by dozens of other measurements. What it means in practice is that the Sun acts as a gravitational lens, bending light from distant sources and focusing it at a point on the far side of the solar system. For light coming from directly in line with the Sun's center, the focal point begins at approximately 550 astronomical units from the Sun, about 14 times farther than Pluto, and roughly 50 billion miles from Earth. If you could place a telescope at that focal point, the amplification it could achieve would be extraordinary. Calculations by NASA researcher Slava Turishev and colleagues suggest that a 1-meter telescope at the solar gravitational lens focal region could achieve an effective aperture equivalent to a telescope tens of kilometers across operating in normal space. Applied to imaging Proxima Centauri b, this would not just detect the planet's presence, it might resolve features on its surface, land masses, oceans if they exist, weather patterns, atmospheric signatures that direct spectroscopy from Earth can only hint at. The solar gravitational lens could, in principle, provide photographic images of another star's planet using a spacecraft and telescope. We are already technically capable of building, at a distance reachable within the lifetimes of people alive today, provided that propulsion technology can get a probe to 550 astronomical units in a few decades, rather than centuries. At the speeds achievable by current and near-future solar sails and nuclear electric propulsion systems, reaching 550 astronomical units in 25 to 50 years is ambitious but conceivable. A NASA study led by Turishev in the early 2020s proposed a detailed mission concept that would send a modest spacecraft on a trajectory that uses a close solar pass to gain speed, a maneuver similar to what the Parker Solar Probe already performs, and then coasts outward to the focal region. Unlike breakthrough Starshot, which requires technologies not yet built at any scale, the solar gravitational lens mission requires advances in propulsion that are challenging but incremental. A probe placed at 550 astronomical units would, in effect, turn the Sun itself into humanity's most powerful telescope, and what it showed us about Proxima b, or any other target in its line of sight, would transform the case for or against sending anything, human or machine, to that destination. What Proxima Centauri teaches us, looked at honestly, is not that the universe is closed to us. It is that the universe is indifferent to our timelines, our biology, and our current level of technology. The nearest star is 4.24 light-years away. That distance is not a punishment or a barrier placed there to stop us. It is simply a feature of the cosmos, the same cosmos that assembled the atoms in our bodies from supernova debris, and that permitted, on one unremarkable rocky planet, a species curious enough to measure the distance to other suns. We know more about Proxima Centauri now than anyone alive a century ago could have imagined knowing. We know it is a red dwarf with about 12% the Sun's mass. We know it has at least one planet sitting in its habitable zone, though the zone of a flare star is nothing like the quiet garden our Earth inhabits. We know the planet's approximate mass and orbital period. We know the character of the radiation environment it endures. We know, with growing precision, why that radiation is hostile to life as we understand it. The knowledge itself is a form of progress, even when what it reveals is inhospitable. The probes will go first, not because human beings lack the will or the courage to go, but because probes can endure what people cannot. And the information they return will tell us whether what waits at the other end is worth the extraordinary cost of sending someone there. If Proxima b's atmosphere is gone, and its surface is sterilized by decade after decade of superflares, then the destination changes. Perhaps there is a planet farther out in the system, in a wider orbit, shielded somewhat from the worst of the stellar violence. Perhaps the subsurface tells a different story. Perhaps neither of these things is true, and the next wave of powerful space telescopes turns our attention toward a different system with a more welcoming world. There are other stars worth considering. Tau Ceti, 11 light-years away, is a quiet G-type star, similar to our Sun in mass and temperature, with a planetary system that includes at least one candidate in or near its habitable zone. Epsilon Eridani, 10 light-years out, is younger and more active, but possesses a debris disk consistent with a developing planetary system. TRAPPIST-1, at 39 light-years, hosts 7 rocky planets in orbital configurations that have generated enormous excitement, 3 of them sitting in the habitable zone of their small red dwarf host. The discovery that multiple potentially habitable worlds exist within 40 light-years of Earth, a region containing fewer than 500 stars, suggests that the galaxy does not reserve its most interesting destination. The question is not whether destinations exist. The question is how we get to any of them. What the Proxima Centauri problem ultimately exposes is a gap not just in technology, but in the relationship between human ambition and human timescales. Most of the things our civilization builds are designed to be useful within a single human lifetime. Roads, buildings, power plants, satellites. They are maintained, replaced, and upgraded continuously, but they are not conceived as gifts to people 500 years from now. Interstellar travel, by contrast, cannot be conceived any other way. The person who designs the mission will not see it launch. The person who oversees the launch will not see it arrive. The person who receives its first transmission from another star will know the names of those who began the project only from history books. This is a different kind of civilization scale thinking than we are accustomed to, more like the decision to plant a tree whose shade you will never sit under than anything the modern world routinely asks of its institutions. There is something clarifying about that thought. The nearest star asks us not merely whether we have the technology, but whether we have the patience, the foresight, and the commitment to build something whose full fruit lies beyond any individual human life. Every civilization that has ever left a mark on history has invested in things it would not live to see completed. Cathedrals, libraries, legal traditions, scientific institutions. The question of whether our civilization will one day reach another star is, in the end, a question about what kind of civilization we are willing to become. In any of these cases, the journey begins not with a spacecraft, but with a question. And the capacity to ask that question, to point instruments at a faint red star 25 trillion miles away and read the details of its character, is something no prior civilization on this planet ever managed. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, where every great journey starts. The closest star may be too far for us today. The question worth living with is not whether that will always be true, but what it would take to change it, and whether this species, with all its complexity and all its contradictions, is the kind of thing that finds out.